One slide only, I promise, on the emissions gap challenge, and then Paris, and then I'll stop. So, are you familiar with this stuff, first of all? Bending the curve and so on. This is a key graph, and you can't just absorb it looking at it now, I'm sorry, but I'll try and talk about it a little bit. To stay within 2 degrees, so the consensus is stay safely within 2 degrees average global increase above pre-industrial levels. We've already hit 1. There's an ongoing growth of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and we need to bend the curve to stay within the 2 degrees, because we're heading up on the baseline or the current policy trajectory by 2030. The key number to remember, and that's very helpful because you can remember the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is 42. So if we can get to 42 gigatons CO2 equivalent by 2030, we're going to be okay. Now we're way off that. We're heading up here, current policies are heading us up here to 57. So there's a gap of 15 or more gigatons gap projected for 2030. Right? This is projections based on we're here. Now, going into Paris, what was different between Copenhagen, which was essentially, we could say, the failed climate talks of 2009 in Paris, was that there was a possibility of a more national bottom-up approach in Paris. And all countries, parties as they're called in new entrant parliaments, were invited to put on the table submissions of how they would tackle climate change, including how they would reduce their emissions. And they nearly all did it. It was a remarkable voluntary process for the developing countries, but they themselves, some of them including Ethiopia and Kenya and Colombia and others, put in really ambitious targets. And the sum of all that effort actually only bends the curve down to here. So we're still heading for 3 degrees despite that great effort made in Paris. So we need to continue to bend the curve and ultimately get to carbon neutrality by 2060, later in the century. So, and there is still this 14 gigaton gap if it's conditional INDCs, which are the commitments the countries made, or 12 if you take into account the conditionality, and the conditionality is around climate finance. So I'll take us quickly to Paris. Why don't we just look at what happened in Paris? NGOs played a really important role in that whole call for climate action. But 450 mayors gathered in Paris under the leadership of the Mayor of Paris is a really important symbol. 80% of global emissions come from cities, 70 to 80%. So cities can drive legislation to tackle emissions. We can tackle much of the global emissions. NGOs played a big role. Somebody told me where that was made the other day. I think it's made in Suffolk actually, but I met it in Paris, this polar bear. But developing countries play an important role, and I say this proudly because my organisation supports developing countries, and that was what was so important. There's a whole dialogue around justice and climate change, because developing countries, by and large, on the front line of the impacts of climate change. Here, Geza Martins from the Angola leading the least developed countries is calling for keeping the overall target within 1.5 degrees and appealing to all the delegates in the main hall. Here, a Vice President of the Marshall Islands is signing an agreement which led to the High Ambition Coalition, which was a group of countries that really pushed through the agreement that kept us within sight of staying within 1.5 degrees. And here's Tosin Panampanu from the DRC, who leads the African group of negotiators. They all play a key role. So you would have read about US and China, and basically it was them. It wasn't. There was also a number of others that played a key role. So what happened in Paris was zero net emissions between 2050, staying within the 2 degrees, or if possible 1.5 degrees. Technically possible, really hard to achieve, but in terms of justice, very important. The mitigation targets, a rather vague adaptation goal. I won't go into loss and damage, but that's very important from a social justice point of view. Reviews of these NDCs, these targets, so you don't just submit it. How are you going to police this globally? Climate finance, I think Girish has already alluded to the fact that there was a target, but it's pretty vague, and how much is that's going to be provided, and where's it going to come from? How are we going to report on emissions reductions, and who's going to police who, and what's the review process? And that's what the stock take is. And clearly we had to scale up ambition. We've only bent the curve towards 3 degrees, we've got to bend it down further. A lot was achieved, and it was better than I and most commentators would have thought. It's been accused of being weak, it's ambiguous. The roadmap to 0.0 is way off. The climate finance and enforcement mechanisms, lots of stuff still to be worked on. By no means, it's a great start, the agreement in Paris. And so the key challenge going forward is maintaining the momentum, agreeing some of the details in the architecture, that's the issues of transparency and reporting, and then translating this into action at national level. I was talking about the horror of these people being killed in the collapsing power station in Dunkirk 3 weeks ago. That's a consequence of UK climate legislation. You know that, don't you? That was a coal-fired power station. The European legislation has got so tough for emissions from coal-fired power stations that switched to being a gas-fired power station, and so they're in the process of demolishing the generating turbines from the coal-fired station when it collapsed like sadly on people a couple of weeks ago. The UK has a process, and most countries don't yet have that process. So translating that into action, shifting the energy systems, shifting transport, shifting the way the UK is terrible in energy efficiency and housing legislation and housing energy efficiency. There's lots of things to do, and much can be done. So at that point, maybe I'll pass the job.
Back in 2008, I did a study for Oxfam on climate change impacts on Uganda, and I talked to literally hundreds of farmers, and they all said the same thing about how the climate was changing. I mean, in terms of the growing seasons and the rainy season in particular. And I think it was probably the formative experience of my career, in the sense of it really convinced me that this is what was happening, the people knew what was happening, and it was important. It was already happening. And suddenly it continues to happen. This is the problem with the trajectory that Sam has sketched out, that we are on a moving escalator. There's no stopping climate change. All we can do is reduce the pace at which it is going to happen. So I'll come back to that. But that's not what I've been working on particularly in the last 6 or 7 months or so. And I wanted to talk about climate change, El Nino and the SDGs, and in a sense come at the SDGs in a slightly roundabout route. So you've probably heard about El Nino. In fact, a show of hands, who has heard of the El Nino phenomenon? Oh my God, thank you, fantastic. Right, I hardly need to explain it. But as you know, just briefly, it is a warming of the sea surface temperatures in the Eastern Pacific. It happens every few years, it's a natural phenomenon, but every so often you get a super El Nino. And this has been termed the Godzilla of El Ninos. And in fact, today I saw a chart of sea surface temperatures, which a guy called Chris Funk from FuseNet sent me. And they're extraordinary. I mean, they are off the chart, and they're still off the chart. So there's still a lot of power, a lot of oomph in this El Nino, even though it is said to have peaked. The impacts. Well, we have been facing, and we are facing a massive impact on growing seasons around the world. And in particular in southern Africa, the rainy season, which started in October and November, is just coming to an end. They've had record temperatures. They've had extremely poor rains across most of South Africa, large parts of Zimbabwe, Zambia, which has been a breadbasket in the last few years, and Malawi in particular. In Ethiopia, we're facing a humanitarian crisis that is potentially as bad as in 1984-85. Potentially, I said, there are big differences in the political context. And there are massive problems of drought across Central America and also in some of the Pacific islands, notably Papua New Guinea. So this is all happening at a time when the world faces a humanitarian crisis or crises of very different kinds due to conflict in the Middle East and in countries like South Sudan, I'll remind us as well about. Why this rings a bell with me, I do have a personal interest. I started work for Oxfam 30 years ago, after the El Nino of 1984, 83, 84, 85. And in many ways, why I wanted to work for Oxfam was seeing the pictures of famine that were on the television at the time. And you're too young to remember them. But, you know, they were shocking. They were absolutely shocking. There was something which it was hard to conceive could exist in the 20th century. And so that was why, as a journalist, I started offering my services at the time to Oxfam to say, do you want to help just publicising this, anything I can do, etc. I got a job with Oxfam, I've been there ever since. So this is really quite personal, and curiously and perhaps prophetically at the time, Oxfam had just published a report called Weather Alert, and it was about El Nino, but it didn't say climate change, it said a changing climate. But it was probably the first NGO report which brought together these phenomena and pointed out that this El Nino was happening on the back of rising global temperatures. And so, what has El Nino got to do with climate change? Well, El Nino, as I said, it's a natural phenomenon. It happens anyway. But it's happening on the back of record temperatures in 2014. And although an El Nino wasn't declared in 2014, in some ways that's an artificial construct of how we measure it. Because in fact, there were borderline El Nino conditions. And the growing seasons in southern Africa and around the world, they responded as if an El Nino was happening. And it's been estimated, there's a lot of discussion in the scientific literature at the moment about what is the contribution of climate change and of El Nino, respectively, to the record global temperatures of 2015. And what will they be to what was almost certainly going to be record global temperatures in 2016. And there's certainly an El Nino effect because you get all of this heat from the ocean is released into the atmosphere. However, there's good reasons to believe that that is still only 15 to 20% perhaps maximum of the contribution to global temperatures. The rest comes from carbon dioxide, methane and greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. And so you've got these record temperatures which in turn have seriously exacerbated the lack of precipitation because you increase the evaporation rate and so on. And that is what stresses the crops particularly. And the other connection is that the number of scientific studies, a guy called Wenju K, I think is how you pronounce it, in Australia, done some really interesting work, and he's basically saying the more you heat up the oceans, the more likely it is that we will see these kinds of extreme El Ninos and their counterparts, the extreme La Ninas, happening twice as often, twice as frequently, instead of every 20 years in the case of El Ninos, every 10 years. In the case of La Ninas, instead of every 23 years, every 13 years, and so on. So the two things do go together, they ratchet each other up in their effects.